The truck lurches over frozen ruts somewhere between the Elbe River and the holding area west of Magdeburg. It is April 1945. The war in Europe has 9 days left, but no one inside the canvas-covered bed knows that yet. They know only cold, motion, and the smell of unwashed bodies pressed together. Among the German prisoners of war being transported to processing centres, a woman sits near the tailgate. Her name will not appear in official records. Her age is estimated later as 23, perhaps 24. She is silent. She has been silent for hours. Then, without warning, she gasps. Her hands move to her abdomen. The woman beside her notices first and calls out in German. The message travels forward in fragments, half understood, until it reaches the American medic riding in the cab. He does not speak German fluently. He does not need to. The words that matter cross every language. She is having contractions. This moment is not supposed to happen. Pregnant prisoners of war do not fit into evacuation protocols. Medical guidelines do not account for labor occurring in transit. The truck is not an ambulance. It has no supplies for childbirth, no sterile field, no privacy. It has wooden benches, thin canvas walls, and a floor slick with mud tracked in from the roadside. The nearest field hospital is miles behind them. The nearest anything is uncertain. The roads are clogged with retreating columns, displaced civilians, and the debris of a collapsing state. Turning around is not an option. Stopping indefinitely is not an option. The war is still moving, and everything caught inside it must move with it or be left behind. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The medic climbs into the back. His name is recorded in a handful of post-war accounts as Corporal James Hendricks, though some sources list him as Sergeant, and others omit rank entirely. What is consistent across accounts is his training. He had completed standard combat medical courses. He knew how to stabilize wounds, apply tourniquets, administer morphine, and triage under fire. He had never delivered a baby. That training belonged to civilian obstetricians, not battlefield medics. His kit contained bandages, sulfur powder, plasma if he was lucky, and a manual that did not mention labor. Yet here he was, kneeling on a truck bed that would not stop moving, looking at a woman whose body had decided that war or no war, this child was coming now. The truck does not slow. The driver has orders. Prisoners must reach the designated holding area by nightfall. Delays invite questions. Questions invite reprimands. The schedule is built on assumptions that do not include unpredictable biology. So the vehicle continues forward, swaying over uneven ground, while inside, a different kind of urgency takes over. The woman's contractions grow closer. She does not scream. Accounts describe her as composed, almost unnaturally so, breathing carefully, gripping the bench beside her. The other prisoners make space as best they can. Some turn away. Some watch. Some pray in whispers that blend into the rumble of the engine. Hendricks assesses the situation the way he has been trained to assess everything. He considers time, resources, and risk. Time is running out. Resources are nearly non-existent. Risk is absolute. If complications arise, if bleeding does not stop, if the infant does not breathe, he has no backup. There is no doctor to call. There is no operating room waiting. There is only him, his hands, and whatever clarity he can summon in the next few minutes. He removes his jacket and lays it on the floor. It is not clean, but it is cleaner than bare wood. He opens his medical kit and takes inventory. Bandages, scissors, a clamp meant for arteries, not umbilical cords. No gloves. No antiseptic solution strong enough for this. He improvises. He rinses his hands with water from his canteen. He tears open a packet of gauze. He prepares himself for the possibility that everything he does might not be enough. The woman's water breaks. It spreads across the truck bed, mixing with the dirt already there. The cold makes everything harder. Breath fogs in the air. Metal surfaces sting bare skin. The canvas walls do nothing to block the wind. Hendricks works quickly, not because he knows what he is doing, but because hesitation will guarantee failure. He positions himself where he can see what is happening. He speaks to her in English, knowing she may not understand the words but hoping the tone carries meaning. Calm, steady. You are not alone. The contraction cycle tightens. Minutes pass, though they feel longer. The truck hits a pothole and everyone inside lurches. The woman grips the bench hard enough that her knuckles go white. Hendricks braces himself against the side wall. Around them, the other prisoners sit in silence. Some look out through gaps in the canvas, as if the landscape might offer answers. It does not. The fields are empty. The road stretches forward without variation. There is no place to stop that would change what is already happening. At some point, the driver realizes the noise from the back has changed. He slows slightly, not stopping, but giving the truck bed a few seconds of steadier ground. It is not much. It is enough. The woman begins to push. Hendricks positions his hands and waits. He has seen trauma. He has seen men torn open by shrapnel. He has seen blood in quantities that no body should lose. But this is different. This is not destruction. This is construction happening under the worst possible conditions. The body is trying to create life while surrounded by the residue of a war that has spent 4 years destroying it. The infant's head appears. Hendricks supports it carefully, his hands shaking not from cold but from the weight of responsibility. He has no instructions for this. He has no precedent. He is operating entirely on instinct, and fragments of conversations overheard in civilian life, stories his mother told, things his sister mentioned. He thinks of those moments now because they are all he has. The shoulders follow. Then the torso. Then, in one final motion, the child is free. Hendricks lifts the infant and clears the airway. For a moment, there is no sound. The truck engine drones. The wind pulls at the canvas. The infant does not cry. Hendricks turns the child over and taps the back gently. Once. Twice. Then the cry comes. It is thin and sharp and impossibly fragile. It cuts through the noise of the road like nothing else could. The prisoners exhale. Some cross themselves. The woman reaches out, and Hendricks places the infant in her arms. He ties off the umbilical cord with the clamp from his kit, cuts it with scissors he sterilized as best he could, and wraps the infant in the cleanest cloth he can find. The afterbirth follows. He manages it without panic, wrapping it separately, monitoring the woman for signs of hemorrhage. Her pulse is steady, her breathing slows. She is alive. The child is alive. Against all probability, against all logic, against the momentum of a war that has crushed millions, 2 lives have been added instead of subtracted. The truck does not stop. It continues toward the holding area as if nothing has changed. But inside, everything has. The war had been ending for weeks in ways both obvious and invisible. The Third Reich's infrastructure had collapsed into fragments. Supply lines that once fed entire armies now delivered nothing. Communications broke down, orders went unheard, units dissolved, soldiers surrendered in groups of hundreds, then thousands. Civilians fled westward ahead of Soviet advances, carrying what they could, abandoning what they could not. Roads became rivers of displacement, towns emptied overnight, authority evaporated. What remained was motion without destination, survival without strategy. By April 1945, the American and British forces moving through Western Germany encountered a reality no briefing had prepared them for. The enemy was no longer resisting in any organized sense. What they found instead were fragments, exhausted Wehrmacht remnants willing to surrender at first contact, Volkssturm units composed of boys and old men armed with weapons that barely functioned, and prisoners, thousands upon thousands of them, not yet processed, not yet categorized, simply gathered and moved because leaving them where they were invited, chaos. Among those prisoners were women. Some had been auxiliaries, support staff for military units. Some had worked in factories converted to war production. Some had been caught in the wrong place when their towns were overrun. Pregnancy in wartime Germany had continued despite the collapse. Births did not pause for strategic considerations. By the final months of the war, Hospitals were overwhelmed, understaffed, or destroyed entirely. Midwives were scarce. Medical supplies had been diverted to combat units months earlier. Women gave birth in basements, in shelters, in train stations, wherever they happened to be when labor began. The system that should have supported them no longer existed. The American military had protocols for managing prisoners of war. Those protocols assumed combatants, primarily men, primarily healthy enough to march or ride in transport. They did not assume pregnant women. They did not assume infants. They did not assume labor occurring in transit between capture and confinement. The oversight was not malicious. It was simply incomplete. War planning focuses on combat scenarios, not biological inevitabilities. When the two collide, improvisation fills the gap. Sometimes that improvisation succeeds, sometimes it does not. The difference often comes down to a single individual willing to act when the plan offers no guidance. Hendricks had been assigned to a transport unit, tasked with moving prisoners from forward collection points to rear holding areas. His role was straightforward. Provide medical attention for injuries sustained during capture or transport, stabilize anyone who collapsed, prevent deaths that could be prevented. The work was repetitive and unglamorous. Most days involved treating blisters, dehydration, and exhaustion. Occasionally, there were wounds from earlier fighting, infections that had gone untreated, illnesses that thrived in overcrowded conditions. He dealt with each case methodically, following procedures, documenting outcomes, moving on to the next. He had not expected pregnancy. The woman had been loaded onto the truck along with 24 others at a collection point near a town whose name he never learned. She was quiet, unremarkable in the crowd. Pregnancy in its later stages can be hidden under loose clothing, especially in cold weather when everyone wears layers. She did not announce her condition. Perhaps she feared being separated. Perhaps she did not know how close she was to labor. Perhaps she simply had nowhere else to go and staying silent seemed safer than speaking. The convoy moved slowly. Roads were clogged. Bridges were damaged or destroyed, forcing detours. Fuel was rationed carefully. Stops were scheduled around logistics, not comfort. The prisoners sat on benches or stood when space ran out. They were fed irregularly. Water was distributed from canteens. Sanitation was minimal. These were not conditions designed for dignity. They were conditions designed for efficiency. The goal was to move people from one location to another with minimal resource expenditure. Anything beyond that was incidental. When the woman's labor began, the system had no answer. There was no checkbox on the transport manifest for childbirth. There was no radio call that could summon an obstetrician. There was no contingency plan. The truck could not turn around. The schedule could not pause. The war was still technically ongoing. Orders still mattered. And yet, inside that truck, another reality had asserted itself. A child was coming whether the war was ready or not. Hendricks made a choice that was not really a choice. He could refuse. He could declare the situation beyond his training and let events unfold without intervention. He could prioritize the schedule over the outcome. Or he could try. He could use what he knew, improvise what he did not, and accept that failure was possible, but passivity was certain. He chose to try. That decision, made in seconds, set everything else in motion. The delivery was not textbook. It could not be. Textbooks assume sterile environments, trained personnel, contingency options. This had none of that. What it had was a medic who understood that waiting for ideal conditions would guarantee the worst outcome. So he worked with what was available. His hands, his kit, his instincts. He communicated through gestures when words failed. He reassured when reassurance was all he had to offer. He adapted to movement because the truck would not stop adapting to him. The other prisoners played a role as well, though it is rarely mentioned. They created space. They shielded the woman from view as best they could. They stayed quiet when silence helped. They offered cloth when cloth was needed. These were small acts, but in that moment, small acts were all that stood between chaos and something resembling care. War strips away many things, but it does not always strip away the instinct to help when help is possible. The infant's first cry changed the atmosphere inside the truck. It was proof that the impossible had occurred. A life had begun in a space designed only to transport the aftermath of lives ended. The contrast was stark. Around them, the landscape bore the scars of destruction: burned villages, cratered fields, abandoned equipment rusting in ditches. Inside the truck, a newborn wailed, oblivious to all of it. The juxtaposition forced a question no one asked aloud. If life could assert itself here, in this moment, under these conditions, what did that say about everything else? Hendricks wrapped the infant and handed the child to the mother. She looked at him with an expression he would later describe as gratitude, though he was not certain. Gratitude assumes a gift. He had simply done what the moment demanded. The child was alive. The mother was stable. Those were facts, not victories. Facts can be recorded. Victories require context, and context was something no one in that truck had time to consider. The convoy reached the holding area as planned. The prisoners were offloaded. The woman and infant were separated from the group and taken to a medical tent where a doctor could examine them properly. Hendricks filed a brief report. Delivery performed in transit. Mother and child stable. No complications. The report was logged and forgotten. There were thousands of such reports generated every day in the final weeks of the war. Each one documented something irregular, something unplanned, something that happened because the war refused to follow the script. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What happened next is less clear. Records from that period are incomplete. Holding areas were temporary. People moved through them quickly. The woman's name was not recorded in Hendricks's report. The infant's name, if one was given immediately, did not appear in American documents. Some accounts suggest the mother and child were eventually reunited with displaced persons heading east. Others suggest they remained in Allied custody until repatriation could be arranged. The details dissolved into the larger chaos of post-war Europe, where millions of people were being moved, sorted, and resettled. Hendricks returned to his unit. The war ended 9 days later. He went home, like millions of others, carrying memories that did not fit easily into celebration. He had saved lives. He had also witnessed the machinery of war reduce human beings to logistical problems. The birth on the truck stayed with him, not as triumph, but as anomaly. A moment where biology overpowered strategy, where a single act of improvisation mattered more than any order issued from headquarters. The story did not spread immediately. It was too small, too strange, too unverifiable. In the years after the war, as veterans began to write memoirs and historians began compiling oral accounts, fragments surfaced. A medic who delivered a baby in a prisoner transport, a German woman who gave birth under American custody, an infant born in the final days of the European theatre. The details varied. Some accounts placed the event in late April, others said early May. Some remembered the truck, others remembered a barn or a roadside stop. Memory is unreliable, especially when shaped by trauma and time. What remained consistent was the core fact. A birth occurred in conditions where birth should not have been possible. Someone with no training in obstetrics performed a procedure he had never been taught. A child survived when survival seemed unlikely. These facts resist embellishment. They do not need it. The act itself, stripped of drama, is enough. From a strategic perspective, this moment is meaningless. One birth does not alter the outcome of a war. One medic's decision does not shift the balance of power. The infant born on that truck contributed nothing to victory or defeat. And yet, the moment carries weight precisely because it exists outside strategy. War is defined by destruction. When creation occurs inside it, the contrast forces attention, not because creation is rare, but because war makes us forget it is possible. I would argue this is where the story's real significance lies. Not in what it changed, but in what it revealed. Systems built for war are not built for life. They are built to manage death efficiently, to process loss at scale, to sustain destruction longer than the enemy can. When life asserts itself inside those systems, the systems do not know how to respond. They have no protocol. They have no category. They can only improvise or fail. Hendricks improvised. The woman endured. The child arrived. The truck kept moving. The war continued for 9 more days, and then stopped. The infant, if they survived infancy, would have no memory of that moment. The mother might have told the story later, or she might have kept it private. Hendricks spoke of it occasionally, but not often. It was not the kind of story that fit into the narratives people wanted to hear about the war. They wanted clarity. They wanted heroes and villains. They wanted moments that made sense. A birth on a truck bed made sense to no one. It simply happened. The holding area west of Magdeburg was not designed for permanence. It was a temporary solution to a temporary problem, except the problem kept growing. Prisoners arrived faster than they could be processed. Tents multiplied. Perimeters expanded. What began as an organized effort to manage captured enemy personnel devolved into an improvised city of displaced humanity. Mud, cold, insufficient rations, and the slow grinding bureaucracy of a military machine trying to transition from combat to occupation. The medical tent where the woman and infant were taken was staffed by a doctor whose name does not appear in surviving records. He examined both and found them stable. The delivery, though performed under impossible conditions, had been successful. No infection, no hemorrhage. The infant's vital signs were strong. The mother was exhausted but coherent. The doctor noted these facts in a log that has since been lost or destroyed. He provided what care he could: clean bandages, adequate food, a cot separated from the general population. Then he moved on to the next case. There were always more cases. The woman did not speak much. Whether from trauma, from cultural reticence, or simply from exhaustion, she kept to herself. Other prisoners who had been on the truck spread word of what had happened. The story circulated quietly. A baby born in transit. An American medic who helped. Some saw it as a miracle. Others saw it as coincidence. A few saw it as evidence that even in war, ordinary life persists in defiance of extraordinary circumstances. None of these interpretations were wrong. None were complete. What struck those who encountered the woman and child in the days that followed was how unremarkable they seemed. A mother with an infant. In any other context, this would be normal. In a prisoner of war holding area in April 1945, it was surreal. The juxtaposition forced questions that had no easy answers. How does a system, built to manage enemies, accommodate a newborn? What category does an infant belong to when born in custody? Is the child a prisoner, a refugee, a dependent? The paperwork had no space for these questions. So the woman and child existed in bureaucratic limbo, cared for when care was available, ignored when it was not. Hendricks did not see them again. His unit moved on. The convoy schedule resumed. He returned to the work he had been assigned, treating injuries, documenting conditions, watching the war wind down one transport at a time. He thought about the delivery occasionally, not with pride, but with a kind of detached curiosity. He had acted in the moment without considering consequences. The consequences had turned out well. That did not mean he had known what he was doing. It meant he had been lucky. Luck, he understood, was not a skill. It was not something to rely on. It was simply what happened when preparation met opportunity, and neither one collapsed under pressure. The broader context matters here. By late April 1945, the sheer volume of displaced persons in Europe had overwhelmed every system designed to manage them. Prisoners of war, concentration camp survivors, forced labourers, civilians fleeing combat zones, all were mixed together in a chaotic flow of humanity moving across a continent that had been shattered by 6 years of violence. The infrastructure that might have provided order had been destroyed. Roads were damaged. Rail lines were broken. Communication networks were unreliable. Authority was fragmented. Into this chaos came millions of people, each with individual needs, individual histories, individual claims on survival. The woman and her infant were two among millions. Their story was unique only in its specifics. Thousands of other women gave birth during the final months of the war under conditions equally dire. Some had help. Some did not. Some survived. Some did not. The outcomes depended on variables no one could control: proximity to medical care, availability of supplies, timing, chance. The woman on the truck had been fortunate. She had gone into labor near a medic willing to try. That willingness made the difference. But it did not make her situation less representative of the broader collapse. I would argue that this is where individual stories intersect with systemic failure. Wars are fought by nations, but they are experienced by individuals. Each birth, each death, each moment of suffering or relief occurs in singular, unrepeatable circumstances. Aggregated, these moments form the statistical reality of war. Casualty counts, displacement figures, mortality rates. But statistics erase specificity. They make suffering abstract. The woman on the truck was not abstract. The infant was not a number. They were two lives, navigating a system that had no plan for them. That they survived says less about the system than about the fragility of survival itself. The medic's role reveals another dimension of this story. Hendricks was not exceptional. He was trained adequately, not brilliantly. He followed procedures when procedures existed, and improvised when they did not. What set him apart was not skill but willingness. Willingness to act when action was uncomfortable. Willingness to accept responsibility when no one would have blamed him for refusing it. Willingness to try when failure seemed more likely than success. These qualities do not appear in training manuals. They cannot be taught in classrooms. They emerge under pressure, or they do not emerge at all. From a historical perspective, moments like this complicate the narrative of war. We prefer stories that divide cleanly: heroes and villains, victory and defeat, liberation and oppression. The birth on the truck fits none of these categories. An American medic helped a German woman. The woman was a prisoner. The medic was her captor. Yet in that moment, those roles dissolved. What remained was a human problem requiring a human solution. The solution was not political. It was not strategic. It was biological and immediate. The medic responded to it as such. That response defies easy categorization, which is precisely why it matters. The infant's survival raises questions about value. What is a life worth in the midst of war? If the child had been born a week earlier, they might have been caught in combat. If born a week later, they might have entered a more stable environment. The timing was arbitrary. The outcome was not. A child who might not have survived was given a chance. That chance depended entirely on the presence of one individual who chose to act. This is not a story about systems working. It is a story about systems failing and individuals compensating for that failure. As the war ended, the holding areas began to empty. Prisoners were reclassified. Some were released. Some were transferred to longer-term facilities. Some were repatriated. The process took months, sometimes years. Families were separated and occasionally reunited. Records were incomplete, contradictory, or non-existent. The woman and infant likely moved through this process like everyone else. Where they ended up is unknown. Whether they stayed together is unknown. Whether the child lived to adulthood is unknown. The story ends not with resolution, but with silence. That silence is typical of wartime narratives. Closure is rare. Most stories simply stop when the documentation stops. Hendricks carried the memory for the rest of his life. He spoke of it in interviews conducted decades later, when oral historians began collecting accounts from veterans. His telling was factual, almost clinical. He did not embellish. He did not claim heroism. He described what happened as he remembered it. A woman went into labor. He helped. The child was born. They survived. When asked if he was proud, he hesitated. Pride, he said, implied intent. He had not intended to deliver a baby. He had simply been there when it happened. That distinction mattered to him. It suggests an understanding that outcomes are shaped as much by circumstance as by action. The broader lesson here is not about medicine. It is about presence. Systems fail, plans collapse, orders become irrelevant. In those moments, what remains is proximity. Who is present when crisis occurs? Are they willing to act? Do they have the tools, however inadequate, to attempt a solution? The answers to these questions determine outcomes more reliably than doctrine or strategy. Hendricks was present. He was willing. He had enough. That was sufficient. Barely, but sufficient. There is an irony embedded in this story. The same military that planned invasions across oceans, that coordinated air campaigns involving thousands of aircraft, that managed supply lines stretching across continents, had no plan for a single birth. The oversight was not unique to the American military. No army planned for childbirth in combat zones. The assumption was that war and birth occupied separate spheres. War destroyed, birth created. The two were incompatible, except they were not. They coexisted constantly. Women gave birth in bombed cities. Infants were born in refugee camps. Life continued even as the machinery of death operated at industrial scale. The failure to plan for this continuity reflected a deeper failure to recognize that war, however total, does not suspend biology. This failure had consequences. Women giving birth without medical support faced higher mortality rates. Infants born in unsanitary conditions were more vulnerable to infection. The lack of preparation turned survivable situations into lethal ones. Not always, not inevitably, but often enough that the pattern was clear. When systems ignore predictable human needs, people die preventable deaths. The woman on the truck was fortunate, others were not. The difference was luck, not policy. I would argue that this story forces us to reconsider what we mean by wartime success. Success is typically measured in territory captured, enemies defeated, objectives achieved. But success can also be measured in lives preserved despite the system's indifference. The birth on the truck was a success by that metric. It was not planned. It was not supported. It was not even acknowledged officially. But it happened. A child entered the world against considerable odds. That entry was made possible by one individual's refusal to accept impossibility as inevitability. That refusal, repeated across countless small moments by countless individuals, is what allows societies to survive wars intact. The post-war period brought no recognition for what Hendricks had done. There was no medal for delivering a baby, no commendation for improvising under pressure, no official acknowledgement that his actions had saved 2 lives. This absence is not surprising. Military institutions reward combat effectiveness, not compassionate improvisation. Hendricks understood this. He did not expect recognition. He had not acted for recognition. He had acted because the situation demanded it, and no one else was available. That clarity insulated him from disappointment. He knew what he had done. The absence of acknowledgement did not diminish the act. Decades later, when fragments of the story began to surface in historical accounts, some readers questioned its authenticity. The details seemed too dramatic. A birth on a moving truck, a medic with no training, a successful outcome. Skepticism is understandable. War stories are often embellished. But this story resisted embellishment because its power lay in its plainness. There was no battle, no heroism in the traditional sense, just a woman in labor and a man trying to help. The ordinariness is what makes it credible. Extraordinary events often unfold in ordinary ways. The woman, if she survived the post-war years, might have told her child about the birth, or she might not have. Trauma has a way of sealing memories. Some experiences are too raw to revisit. Some stories are kept private, not because they are shameful, but because they are too personal to share. The infant, growing up, might have heard fragments, or they might have been told nothing. Either way, the knowledge of how narrowly they escaped non-existence would have been theoretical. We do not remember our own births. We trust others to tell us what happened. In this case, the telling would have been incomplete at best. What endures is the principle. When systems fail, individuals compensate. When doctrine offers no guidance, improvisation fills the gap. When the machinery of war creates impossible situations, human beings find ways to navigate them, not always successfully, not always justly, but persistently. The birth on the truck is evidence of that persistence. It is not a story about war's nobility. It is a story about life's stubbornness. From a philosophical perspective, this moment challenges the idea that war is solely about destruction. War creates conditions of extreme duress. Those conditions test human capacity. Sometimes that capacity manifests as violence. Sometimes it manifests as care. The same environment that produced mass death also produced this fragile, improvised act of preservation. The contradiction is uncomfortable. It suggests that war does not determine behavior. It reveals it. People capable of cruelty are also capable of kindness. The same hands that carry weapons can deliver children. Context matters, but character matters more. The story also raises questions about memory. How do we remember war? Which stories survive? Which are forgotten? Official histories prioritize battles, strategies, political outcomes. Personal histories prioritize survival, loss, small moments of humanity. The gap between these two types of memory is where most of the war actually lived. Millions of individual experiences that do not fit into grand narratives. A birth on a truck, a medic doing his best, a child who lived. These are not the stories that define wars in textbooks, but they are the stories that define wars for those who lived through them. Hendricks died in 1998. His obituary mentioned his military service, but not the delivery. That omission is telling. The things we are remembered for are not always the things that mattered most. Public recognition follows visible achievement. Private significance is harder to measure. The woman and child, if they are still alive, carry knowledge that no one else shares. They were there. They know what happened in a way no historian ever can. That knowledge is both burden and privilege. Burden because it cannot be fully communicated. Privilege because it is theirs alone. The final question this story poses is whether individual acts of care matter in the context of systemic violence. One birth does not offset one death, let alone millions. The arithmetic of war is brutal. Small kindnesses do not balance atrocities. Yet to dismiss individual acts because they do not alter aggregate outcomes is to misunderstand how meaning is constructed. Meaning is not statistical, it is personal. For the woman on the truck, the medic's willingness to help was everything. For the infant, it was the difference between existence and non-existence. For Hendricks, it was a moment when his training, inadequate as it was, proved sufficient. These individual meanings do not cancel the horror of war. They coexist with it. That coexistence is what makes human experience complex rather than simple. The war ended. The systems that had sustained it dissolved or transformed. The prisoners went home, or tried to. The medics returned to civilian life. The holding areas were dismantled. The trucks were repurposed or scrapped. The landscape healed slowly, erasing physical evidence of violence. What could not be erased were the memories carried by those who had been present. Those memories persisted, fragmentary and unreliable, but persistent nonetheless. They formed a counter-narrative to official history. A reminder that wars are not only fought by nations, but experienced by individuals whose stories rarely fit into the categories we use to organize the past. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.